Hello everyone, Mike Zadai here. Hope you're having a good day or evening whenever you're watching this. So I wanted to do just a short series in light of many events that have been happening lately on anti-Semitism. And I have a book by Hal Lindsey. He goes way back. Some of you may remember who he was, Christian theologian. And so what I'd like to do is read out of his book called The Roots of the Holocaust and Anti-Semitism. So I'm going to start reading it, okay, and make comments. Switch glasses here. This is Dr. Barry Leventhal, a popular theologian and teacher in Washington, D.C., noted in his doctoral thesis for the Dallas Theological Seminary, one of the sad reasons for the general acceptance of Nazism, World War II, one of the major sources to the rise of Nazism in Germany came from within the church. It was a growing interest in the evolutionary and destructive higher criticism of the Bible in Germany that fueled the anti-Semitic Nazi war machine. Germany had a long history of Christian anti-Semitism, not only from within the Roman Catholic Church, but even from within the Protestant Church. It was Martin Luther who, in his latter years, turned upon the Jews with a religious fury, thus paving the way for Adolf Hitler to consummate the reformers' great desire for the elimination of the Jewish people. Is it any wonder that Hitler cited Martin Luther in Mein Kampf as one of the great heroes of the German people? Holocaust historian Raoul Hilberg makes a similar shocking observation when he realized how the infamous anti-Semite and Nazi war criminal Julius Streicher quoted Luther in his own defense at the Nuremberg trials. The Nuremberg trials were post-World War II, when all the Nazi leaders were taken into trial for the atrocities that they had done. One of the world's leading scholars on Nazi Germany is William Shirer, a news correspondent in Germany during almost the entire Nazi era. He wrote concerning this one sad aspect of Martin Luther's theology. The time has come for those who study Luther and admire him to acknowledge more unequivocally and less pugnaciously than they have, that on this issue, Luther's anti-Semitism, Luther's thought and language was simply beyond defense. Raoul Hilberg made some observations about this issue that all should weigh carefully. He maintains that the Holocaust did not happen in a theological vacuum, but rather was the inevitable result of three consecutive anti-Jewish policies that occurred throughout the Western history. Hilberg says anti-Jewish policies and anti-Jewish actions did not have their beginning in 1933. For many centuries and in many countries, the Jews have been victims of destructive action. What was the object of these activities? What were the aims of those who perished in anti-Jewish deeds? Throughout Western history, three consecutive policies have been applied against Jewry in its dispersion. To summarize, since the 4th century after Christ, there have been three anti-Jewish policies: conversion, expulsion, annihilation. The second, expulsion, appeared as an alternative to the first, and the third, annihilation, as an alternative to the second. The Nazi destruction process did not come out of a void. It was the culmination of a cyclical trend. We observed the trend in three successive goals of anti-Jewish administrators. Number one, the missionaries of Christianity have said in effect, "You have no right to live among us as Jews." Number two, the secular rulers who followed proclaimed, "You have no right to live among us." Number three, the German Nazis, "You have no right to live." These progressively more drastic goals brought in their wake a slow, steady growth of anti-Jewish actions and anti-Jewish thinking. The process began with the attempt to drive the Jews into Christianity. The development was continued in order to force the victims into exile. It was finished when the Jews were driven to their deaths. The German Nazis then did not discard the past, they built on it. They did not begin the development, they completed it. I must confess that I believe that what these men have observed is woefully true. But the most important factor in this chain of development of anti-Semitism has been overlooked by almost everyone. Hilberg astutely observed above that the anti-Jewish policies can be traced to the attitudes of the church that began in the 4th century. This was the very time when the teachings of an influential early church father named Origen of Alexandria began to take effect in the church. So many of these early Christian theologians saw what was called replacement theology, that the church replaced Israel because Israel rejected the Messiah. And so with that theological bias going on, then the Jews deserved punishment. They deserved to get to reap what they sowed, that they rejected their Messiah. And so Israel then, the early theologians, was replaced by the church. Now, I'm not going to get into it right now, but it's really ludicrous because then you would have to go throughout the Old Testament passages, and then you'd have to go, well, how does the church replace Israel with this prophetic word, with this prophetic word, with this prophetic word? How does the church do that? Well, the church can't. And so they did a lot of shuffling about and tried to convince people that the church replaced. And this is what people began to believe. And then built upon that was and this is satanic, this is where it begins, a dislike for the Jews because they rejected the Messiah. And then it began to they began to persecute the Jewish people. So, well, let's continue to read here. Christians today need to pay close attention to the following historical record of how good Christian leaders with erroneous prophetic views laid the theological groundwork for evil men, often masquerading as Christians, to justify the extermination of the Jewish race. And sadly, it also influenced many true Christians to join in with the prevailing anti-Semitism. The most responsible for changing the way the church interpreted prophecy was Origen. I think I pronounced his last name right. He was a leading teacher of theology and philosophy at the influential school of theology in Alexandria in Egypt at the beginning of the 3rd century. Church historian Newman reports Origen was the first to reduce the allegorical method of interpretation to a system. His method of scripture interpretation was soon adopted throughout the whole church and prevailed throughout the Middle Ages. In this particular influence, his influence was bad, only bad. So here you have an early Christian theologian who's using the allegorical method. In other words, allegory is not fact. It's not real. It's symbolism. It must be noted that Origen was not an evil man. In fact, he was a scholarly Christian philosopher with courageous faith who lived a humble, ascetic life. But because of his desire to harmonize the New Testament with the philosophy of Plato, he powerfully introduced, taught, and spread allegorical method of interpreting the scriptures, particularly in the area of prophecy. From this seemingly harmless fact of Jewish history evolved a system of prophetic interpretation that created the atmosphere in which Christian anti-Semitism took root and spread. It's amazing how Satan, he works very subtly. He works with planting some seeds. He waters it and lets it grow. And then he continues to nurture it till it grows and grows and grows and produces evil fruit. Using this method of prophetic interpretation, church theologians began to develop the idea that Israelites had permanently forfeited all their covenants by rejecting Jesus as the Messiah. This view taught that these covenants now belong to the church, and that it is the only true Israel now and forever. The view also taught that the Jews will never again have a future as a divinely chosen people, and that the Messiah will never establish his messianic kingdom on earth that was promised to them. The consequences of this doctrine were subtle at first. The most serious consequences was that the protection provided by the clear scriptural warnings of God against those who would harm his covenant people were snatched away. A feeling of contempt followed, since in the eyes of those who held these views, the Jews were clinging to a hope that now belonged only to the church. From these attitudes evolved the idea that they were blind impostors under the curse of God and unrepentant Christ killers. Their tenacious efforts to remain in separate and distant race with the hope of Messiah's future coming to establish a promised kingdom of God were viewed as a special arrogance. The church leaders saw no justification for the Jews to remain a distinct people, since, in their view, their hopes belong exclusively to the church forever. Many of these factors were correctly observed by the Encyclopedia Judaica, though it is in error in some of its analysis. This is what it says. The reasons for the extraordinary and tragic tension between Christianity and Judaism are not to be sought merely in the differences in religious beliefs and dogmas, which exist also in relation to other religions. The tension is due essentially to the ambivalent position in which the church found itself vis-a-vis with Israel. By explicitly claiming not to be a new religion, and by covering itself with the fulfillment of the promises of the Bible, the Old Testament, are expressed in the covenant with the patriarchs and in the message of the prophets, the church placed itself squarely on a Jewish foundation. It was the consummation of the biblical promise. The church was the true Israel of God. The image implied that theologically Judaism was an inferior religion. Historically, the Jewish people had played out its positive role, and morally, the Jews were examples of stubborn blindness, and even at best, in its biblical phase, Israel had been rebellious and had persecuted its prophets, its law. Albeit divine was a preparatory discipline. The church being God's true Israel, according to the Spirit, the Jewish people no longer had any vocation or reason to exist, except as a witness to the misery and degradation that will befall a people originally chosen by God, but unfaithful to its election by rejecting the Messiah and bringing about his death. This quote brings out correctly that when the church began to see itself as the true Israel of God, the inheritor of the covenant promises made to Israel, then in the eyes of the church, the Israelites ceased to have any legitimate purpose or right to exist as a people. Again, it's important to note that the only way the church could arrive at this view was by interpreting prophecy allegorically. From this error in eschatology, which eschatology means the doctrine of last things or prophecy, to outright anti-Semitism was only a matter of time. So you can see where the seeds were planted. and then Satan watched it grow. You know, some of the worst anti-Semitism has come from the church, people. Christians, not Muslims, Christians. Now, when I'll talk about Islam, when Islam comes into development, Muhammad, who's the founder of Islam, just say this real quick. He had a vision from an angel, and he went to Jerusalem, and the Jewish priests said no. He was angry, very angry, and he went back to Medina. I think it was 6 years later. He put together an army, and he went into Medina, and he murdered 600 Jewish men, raped their women, and took their children. Thus began Islam. Truly an anti-Semitic, but you see where it started. It started in hate for the Jewish people. Now, Christians, should we be like that? And yet, in World War II, as Hitler was rising to power, he was seen as a Christian. And Christians in Europe, in Germany rather, they just, loved him because he was going to bring them out of the horror of World War I and the poverty that they were living in because of World War I. And so they believed what he had to say. And so when he began his anti-Semitic boasting and blaming the Jews, Christians in Germany believed him. So, okay, that's lesson 1. I'm started on anti-Semitism, and so please tune into the next one. This is very important.